Welcome everyone to the Underground Games QA podcast, a podcast about quality assurance in the video game industry. My name is Ariel Smith, my pronouns are she, her, and I am a test discipline manager with Bungie. We have two fellow QA professionals joining us today, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
So I'm Marcin, and my pronouns are he, him.
My name is Trevor Page. I am a senior test manager at Bungie, and my pronouns are he, him.
So just a quick disclaimer here, all individuals appearing on the podcast are not doing so as official representatives of their respective companies, and the opinions expressed here are their own. All right, so let's talk about data. That's what we're talking about today. How can QA use data to inform what we do and also inform the people around us? But more specifically, we're talking about a particular point of data called escaped defects. So before we get into the details of what escaped defects are, I want to talk generally speaking about how do we use data. So Marcin and Trevor, what do you think? How do we use data in QA? What is the purpose of actually gathering cold hard facts instead of just relying on our gut?
So I think we rely on our gut a lot in the industry, or not just in QA, right? And data is one of those things, like you were just kind of saying, that lets us put some objective truth to some of the things that we're talking about, right? It lets us tell a narrative, a story that's backed up with actual things that you can point to and talk around, as opposed to, I feel like we're missing a lot here. I feel like we're shit at being a lot of bugs in this area, right? Those are very loaded statements, as opposed to, I've sat down, I've looked at the data, we're actually on par with what we would expect for this release, right? It lets you kind of push back, tell a narrative, and back up your points and your arguments in a way that's a bit harder to just argue with your gut or your feelings.
Yeah, it's a nice anchor for us to ensure that whatever decision we make are grounded in reality. We just don't go on our biases or things that we want to be. We get that no matter what we track. So usually it's either player sentiment or any telemetry or anything that helps us to make those decisions. It will help us to make better decisions for the product and for the players. So we are more grounded in reality.
I also think it's really good. Oh, sorry, Ariel.
No, go ahead.
I also think data is really useful, as long as you remember it's often there to prompt questions, right? Data-informed decisions is absolutely something that you should consider, but often data should be a point where you see a number and you ask a question, right? You see a trend and you ask a question. It's very dangerous. Just, okay, this metric is at this threshold. I'm immediately going to jump to some conclusions and change some processes because of that. That's incredibly dangerous, right? If your fixed failure rate, right, is something at 60%, right? Scary number. What's going on there? Don't jump off the cuff, start yelling at people, right? Hell no. No, you want to start poking in. Why is it so high? Do we have junior designers? Do we have brand new testers? Is our documentation really bad, right? What is going on that's leading to that? And data is really good for keying you in on where some danger points are, but then it's on you to start digging in and investigating why.
Yeah, I think the one that comes up a lot in QA is bug count, specifically bugs written by specific testers. And this is a very useful data point to know when certain testers are maybe underperforming because they're just not writing any bugs, or they're not writing as many bugs as people on similar teams. But it's also extremely dangerous to use it as this very objective metric to judge people's performance, because some people in QA are in roles that just don't lead to a lot of bugs being written, right? They might be on the kind of team that rarely has bugs, but when they do have bugs, they're really bad and really scary bugs, and that's why we have a team dedicated to finding those. But they might just not find as many. Or you might have someone who has some kind of automated tool that helps them find bugs. So they're reporting thousands of bugs or something like that, and you don't want to look at that person and say oh, this person is setting the bar and everyone else needs to meet it, because that could potentially cause you to misjudge the work that people are being doing. So yeah, definitely agree that data is useful for telling a story but you have to be careful how you use it because it can be used for bad too if you're looking at it incorrectly or if you're not taking the appropriate context into consideration, right? Like context is a huge thing.
Yeah.
So I like what you said about like it being a prompt to ask questions, right? Like the data does not lead you to a specific conclusion in and of itself. It leads you to questions that can then lead you to interesting answers and solutions.
And those interesting answers and solutions are ultimately what we're sharing.
Yeah.
With other groups.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so the first kind of, so we're actually considering doing an entire series about data, so we'll probably come back to data in future episodes. But for today, what we're focusing on is escaped defects, or specifically a data point called default detection efficiency, or DDE, which is also called default detection rate, DDR. Do either of you have a preference which acronym we use today?
I typically use DDE, but DDR is more fun to say.
DDR is more fun to say. I have to agree with that. But let's go with DDE just because it's what I'm used to too. So what are escaped defects, and what is the default detection efficiency of like a particular game or release? What does that mean?
So an escape defect is essentially a bug or defect that you don't catch while you're in development. It is caught, is reported, it's surfaced after your game goes live, it's out there in the public, people have access to it. Any bugs that you find at that point are considered escape defects. Now, if you punt an issue to a future release, that doesn't count, right? Like you knew about it, you caught it during development, and you made the conscious decision as a project to fix it in the future. Those aren't escape defects. Also, a thing I like to exclude as well as part of that data pool is bugs that, this is particular for like live service games. Like if there's a bug that was introduced, like say an expansion or 2 expansions ago, but no one has ever really encountered it or it's surfaced until like right now. Yes, that's technically, it could fall in, but it pollutes the data a little bit. So I typically would exclude some of that when I'm doing some data analysis around that.
Makes sense. Marcin, any points of disagreement or?
No, Trevor did a great job. I can only add to that what sometimes can be useful and is I've read and so used in different projects or teams, but I also use it on my team as not only to production for live environment, but just of the specificity of Ubisoft as having so many game studios working together and so many games on the same environment. So that environment is kind of like a real production environment for the game teams in itself, just to make sure that the environment that is shared between 20,000 people is stable. We also track not only after it went to productions of the live users, but also on our UAT. So if the bugs escaped from our development environment to UAT environment, so we do additional gate, and we basically do the same just for the internal environment, just to make sure that the internal environment is as clean and as pristine as possible. Because if imagine Connect doing something that basically blocks you from using it, like a serious blocker, then we just blocked out 20,000 people from working, and you don't want to do that.
So you would keep track of how many defaults are escaping both to the test environment and to the live environment?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. So something that could potentially come up is I want to talk more about the context of this stat. So how do we make this stat consistent in a way that we can compare it to different releases and different products? Because for example, the DDE of a release will only go down over time as more and more bugs get surfaced. So how do we make sure that when we're comparing DDE to across releases and across projects that we're comparing it within a similar relevant context?
So the way I approach this is I try to keep the constraints relatively similar, like especially if I'm comparing data sets, right? So the easiest way to do that with DDE is to assign a set time period, right? Where, okay, for the first 4 weeks, for example, after a release, that is our escape window. Theoretically, you could measure escapes like forever, right? Like until you patch the game or until you release a new game, potentially. But after a certain point, like you do need to close a release and you do need to move on. And if a data set is always being open and it's constantly getting updated and being fed, like that's a bit harder to compare apples to apples against with future content. So that's why I like to just, here's our set time frame, like 4 weeks or whatever it is, right? Like any bugs that we capture during this is our total data pool. And then that way, like when you're comparing a future update to the game, you could look at that. It's like, here's 4 weeks of data for this release versus 4 weeks of data for that release. You do also want to take into account like scope of the releases too, right? Like, is it a big patch that you're doing? Is it something relatively normal that you're used to, like, you know, a monthly update or something like that? And those are kind of the data sets you want to group together in a fair way. Like, there are some fun correlations you can draw when you're comparing like larger releases to smaller title updates. But for the most part, it depends on the question that you're asking and what you're looking to get out of the data.
So this is something we talked about in our discussion group last week, but I'm kind of curious to know, like, how do you account for something like a, you know, limitation on just the number of defects you're able to capture by virtue of the number of people you have working on it, right? Like, so for example, we only have, you know, so many community managers or so many testers that are able to like go out and collect bug reports. So if they collect the same number of bug reports with every release because they spend the same amount of time on it, and you know, they just hit their cap and then stop collecting reports, like, how do we make sure that like we're still collecting interesting data for this particular stat, or is there some other like lens or context we have to be looking at this data with?
I think that's a good point. Go.
For me personally, like the most interesting will just shove themselves to our faces. Like community will be super vocal, because I don't think there's a reason or there's intrinsic value on trying to track every possible escape defect. Like there's a diminishing return in that aspect. So it's always good to collect as much data as possible, but I don't think there is intrinsically any point of gathering every possible defect that escapes us. And I think in the context, we are more interested in those issues that are problematic for our community or for the product, so blockers, anything that lowers the experience of the players or the service itself. We can use tools to help us. So, you know, any internal backtracking, bug reporting, so players can report bugs to us, and then use internal tooling to then sift through those and give us that information. So, of course, there's always that risk that sometimes a very nasty issue can go below radar, just because not everybody will be vocal. Like somebody will be they'll encounter something very problematic, but they're like, oh yeah, that's a stupid game, and then just either stop playing and never go back to it. So there's risk running into that. So I think we have to use multiple approaches of not only focusing so much on community managers gathering everything or using us to filter through forums or Twitter or whatever. We have to back us with telemetry or any internal tracking or even providing tools for the players for them, so that the barrier for them to report to us is very minimal. So then they are encouraged to report to us, so we can see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like finding the easiest way to allow the public to be able to report issues, but still give us enough information we need to investigate what's actually going on, right? Like that is a very difficult wire to walk. Because you're right? Like community managers, you'll only have so many. There's only so many hours in the day. But with the modern reality of the internet and Reddit and forums and everything, if your game's buggy, people are going to tell you. And good studios will have ways to source bug reports that aren't purely going through community managers, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe there's an internal alias, maybe there's a message board, maybe you like if you're playing the game on your own and you encounter a bug, right? Like you could report it. So like not limiting the channels that you can and trying to make it as easy as possible for players to get you the information for when they do encounter issues themselves.
Yeah. I also think that there's something to like looking at DDE from a perspective of like different priority levels, right? Like the DDE rate of like showstopper issues is interesting in its own right in a separate way than just the general DDE for a particular release. So like I almost want to create a specific stat that is like the interesting defects detection rate, like in terms of it just being like which are the ones, like lots of bugs go live, sure, but like how many of them do we actually care about? Like that itself is an interesting question. So I think that's part of why like I am very interested in knowing specifically how many like showstopper and high priority issues escaped as opposed to just like the total number of bugs that escaped, because like that total number is going to be like informed by how much bug collection you do, and so sometimes you might have a high rate just because your team was doing a ton of like live bug collection, or it might be really low because they weren't spending a ton of time on that. But generally speaking, the big scary issues, those do get bubbled up pretty consistently, and are the ones that like people care about. And like when game studios have like retrospectives and postmortems and stuff like that, like they're generally not talking about the like death by 1,000 cuts tiny bugs. They're usually talking about like the big scary high priority issues that came up.
But to your point, like you can see, to your point, you can we have that experiment for example with Bethesda games, right? Like I would assume that a bug that you can put a bucket on NPC's head and then steal everything from the inn without it being triggered sounds like a serious issue. But I don't think it was ever fixed because it was so charming and fun to have people do recordings, like slowly putting bucket on NPC's head and then grabbing them and not noticing. Like even though it might be considered like a very serious issue, like we can decide that serious issue that bubbled up is not really a serious issue to fix. So even in that context, we have to be very careful and see, is that game-breaking mechanic is something that we want to fix, or we just like we're okay with that being there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that big total number of like, here is your DDE for the release, right? Like that's useful in comparing release over release and like to look at high level trends. But really, what you want to dig into is what you were saying, Ariel. Like, start slicing that. All right, what's our Sev 1 DDE, right? Like, where the crash is, and what does that look like? What is our DDE by area? What is our DDE by feature and team, right? And if you have historical data to draw upon, release over release, you would be able to see like, hey, our DDE for this team is consistently like at 80, but that's okay, right? Like, because that's just how the feature they're working on is very public. There's a lot of eyes on it. This feature over here, their DDE is 95%, right? So, but that's also because maybe players aren't engaging with that feature. There's not a lot of bug reports that come in on it. So we tend to catch things more often than not internally. And then that lets you make some decisions about how you prioritize the testing and where it goes.
Yeah. Actually, I want to talk more about that right there, what you were talking about in terms of like how it can help you prioritize testing. So what changes might you make based on the DDE of a particular release? Like what sorts of like adjustments would you make to your approach if you noticed that it was particularly high or particularly low? Like what impact does it actually have?
So the DDE is kind of the first step, right? Is what are all the bugs that escaped? Here they are. Here's your number. You have this percentage. The next immediate question that comes to mind is, okay, what are you doing about it? Right? Like, because not all escapes immediately, or like was called out earlier. You have to fix everything, right? Like, maybe not, right? Like, maybe there's some just low priority issues that are relatively benign and aren't really hurting anybody. Maybe you only have a limited amount of life support time and you need to address the high priority issues, right? So maybe there were legitimate escapes in there that you're like, oh crap, we can't have these happen again. Let's update our testing. Let's update our test plans and catch these in the future. Or like, hey, we did this testing. We should have caught this and we didn't. What happened there, right? So that's kind of the next step, is starting to dig into each and every escape and determine what are you going to do about it. Because there are a lot of approaches you can take, like I was saying, depending on like what actually led to why it was escaped. Like, did a tester was this their first time testing, right? And like our documentation or the test cases weren't really written well enough. So it led to an escape, right? Like, okay, cool, action item. Let's update this documentation. Let's update our training. Let's make this a bit better in the future. Did you rely on automation to catch something and like the automation fell over? Okay, cool. Let's dig into that. Let's sit down with our SDETs and have a conversation, right?
Can even lead to some counterintuitive decisions, right? Like usually people want to test as much as possible, but then it might turn out that you're over-testing some particular feature and not paying attention to other features, right? So then it can gives you a nice signal that, hey, this rate for this particular feature is very high. It means that probably we're doing too much testing on it. Like, what's the point of spending so much money and time on it? And then we can also, probably in the data, we can see that this feature is very quite nicely, and then others are basically a slippery slope of things. So maybe your testing is not even out and spaced out and focusing on the areas that require that amount of testing. So you're over-testing in one part, but under-testing in the other.
But Marcin, we want to catch all the bugs. Surely you're not suggesting that we should stop testing or do less testing.
If a team had a DDE of like 99%, that's a worrying statistic for me, honestly. Like, I'm going to go in. It's like, are we over testing? What is the human cost of that number, right? Like, are people doing overtime because they feel like they have to exhaustively test this feature? And then, like, what's the impact to the players of us testing this feature so exhaustively, right? Like you just called out, are we sacrificing quality in other areas of the game to ensure it in this one particular area that players may not care about? Or if there are defects that escape there, they're relatively benign and aren't having a lot of player impact.
Yeah.
So many cool questions you can ask from one set of data.
I mean, and even then too, like, there might be teams that you do want to have a really high stat, right? Like, you might, like, for example, your microtransaction team or whatever team is testing your store probably want a pretty high rate over there because that's where you make all your money, right? Like,
Sure.
You don't want the money to train to stop. So I think that, like, it also makes sense to specifically have different targets for different teams. And then take that into context when you're looking at that specific team's DDE. But there's all kinds of things that can, like, potentially, like, cause it to get skewed, like you were talking about in terms of, like, the testers' seniority and whether or not they were depending on automation. Also, like, the seniority or familiarity with engine of the people who are creating the feature itself. Right?
Absolutely.
Like, I have definitely seen that certain designers will have a higher number of defects in the stuff that they make than other designers. And I'm not, like, throwing shade at them or anything like that. Like, sometimes that's just a factor of, like, they're newer and they're not as familiar with the engine, or they're designing content in a way that is maybe riskier, but also more fun and interesting. So, we're sort of willing to take that risk because what they're doing makes the game more novel and fun.
And if you're collecting robust data as a test org around that, right, and you have that statistics, if you're running low on time and you need to make decisions about where you're prioritizing your testing, maybe the content made by that senior designer who literally made the engine that they're working on, maybe that gets one test pass, right? Where here's a junior designer and their fixed fail rate is a bit higher. Maybe that can get 2 or 3, right? Like, and you can make decisions based around that if time is a factor.
Yeah, like Trevor said, like you can backtrack. It's all about asking questions. Like if the rate went down, then why did it happen? And then you can see, for example, that for this particular feature, it was either a new team or a junior, And then also, you just don't brush over it. Oh, it was a junior and do nothing about it. Like then, okay, why this junior had so many issues? Like, is there anything problematic with documentation or onboarding process? Like how we can prevent it next time? Because we cannot just say never get juniors to do the things because they have to learn, right? So you can make a lot of interesting discoveries about your process and pipeline to fix that statistic.
I've had amazing conversations in the past where I've walked up, to the lead designer of an area or the lead producer, and I've been like, okay, here's our DDE for the release. We're noticing the bulk of our issues are clustered around this particular type of bug. In particular, not shaming anybody, like this, again, a limited audience here, but it's like we're typically seeing these bugs are introduced by junior designers. So we recommend taking a pass at your onboarding documentation or sitting down and running through like what some better workflows would look like to introduce this type of content in the future. And like those have been wonderful conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, maybe we need to talk to them about like limiting their scope. Like junior designers often try to kind of bite off more than they can chew because they want to do like really cool, awesome stuff. And then that really cool, awesome stuff is super complex and doesn't work quite right. Or maybe they're utilizing like tools and like features of the engine that actually don't work very well or things like that. And so they the content just winds up being buggier. So sometimes it's a matter of like kind of getting them to, have more modest like goals in their sites instead.
Yeah. We're all professionals, so our process should adjust to the people that are working on it. So we shouldn't just be saying it's fault of this particular person because they're a junior. That's not an excuse. Like if you're if you're a professional company and you're a producer, project manager, whoever is responsible for the product, we should take all those into account and adjust our processes. So by the end of when we release the product, it's the high quality. Like there's no point in just saying it was junior's fault because that doesn't bring you anywhere.
Yeah. We're trying to help out, improve things for the future, not trying to blame.
Yeah. Cool. Well, what else can we use DDE for? Like, we've talked about like having conversations with designers. We've talked about having conversations with testers. Are there other like, audience members that this is potentially useful for? In terms of talking to them about like the bugginess of a release?
I'd like to use it to see if there's any measurable effect based on external factors. So if like there was a change in headcount on a team, or timeframes were shortened during development outside of the norm, or if there was like conflicting priorities or like other things stacked on top of this release to kind of take people's attention away, I like to use it to see if there's a measured effect, right? Like, hey, we were all talking about how stressful this release was. Let's see if it's reflected in the DDE. Let's compare this to previous releases and see if, you could see like our quality took a hit because of everything else that was going on. We should try to avoid doing this in the future, right?
Yeah, the beauty of this data is that you can use it for anything because it's like a health metric for your company, for your product. Like if you start coughing bugs left and right, if you see the eyes swelling and then the nose sniffling, like you can see that something's wrong. And the same like with the statistics, like if you see visibly that the amount of bugs that escaped is rising, and then noticeably the product is a little bit more, in that context, more sick, then you know that there's something wrong. So you can now do the proper doctor assessment. And anything that you want to touch upon, if it's the lifestyle, if the person is taking care of themselves properly, if they're doing everything as they should, are they listening to the doctor's advice or something else? Like you can use that data for everything. So as Trevor again beautifully said, like it's all about asking proper questions and making sure that the story that you're telling with that data is in context. Because, with any data scientifically, and people know that, statistics always lie, because depending on how you look at the data and depending where you look, it might skew you over and you have internal biases. And if, for example, you want to believe that the issue is because of junior designers, and then you will try to fix junior designers when in fact the problem was somewhere else. But because you were biased and looking at the data, you just told the wrong story, and now you're fixing issues where there are none.
Yeah.
So you have to be very careful with that.
I think it was last week Trevor said something like you could tell like the opposite version of the same story with the same data points. Like
Yeah.
Data's dangerous.
Yeah, like I have this DDE stat. I'm going to use it to tell the story that says we were very buggy this release, or I'm going to use it to tell a story that says we were not very buggy this release. And it's all about like how you frame it and the context that you give it. Like, what are you comparing it to? What specific aspects of it are you looking at? How are you qualifying that data? All of that can potentially change the same like set of data to mean completely different things.
Yeah, like I can declare like we had a 90% DDE, which is a phenomenal rate, and that sounds very good. Or I could say 1 out of every 10 bugs we missed. And that sounds scary.
Yeah. Now I'm kind of curious to dig more into how could we use this for evil? Like if we were villains here, and if we were villains and we wanted to use DDE for bad, what kind of things could we do like to interpret the data incorrectly and like lead people astray? Like. And the reason why I'm asking this is not because like I actually want to mislead people, but like I don't want to do it on accident, right?
Right.
Oof. You wanna like you introduce some fix into the process, and you really want that fix to work because you really invested into that. So you might start ignoring some data to prove your point. So you might just cherry pick data for features that improved and tell yourself a lie that the other ones were because it's a new process. So we don't, it's obviously lower because it's a new process. So how would you, but then you don't use the same logic for those better stats because you say, obviously it's better because it's my process, right? So you can start cherry picking because you want so much that whatever you've done to be positive that you'll basically for things that disprove your theory you'll shun them away and just focus on the points that prove your point, and then you're misleading your team or the company that whatever you did was awesome, even though it might not be. Like it might be just randomness, like just this feature. I mean, this release, it turned out that this is the data, right? And that's that. So, not intrinsically evil, but evil by accident.
I think also like what Marcin was calling out earlier, where if you have a bias, right, and you just want to very much prove it. So going back to the example of, okay, we had conflicting priorities this release. Like we had a lot of things stacked on top of each other. I knew that going in. It upset me during development, right? Like I was frustrated. It's like, gosh, we don't have enough time here. And then afterwards, I want to make that a point to never do that again. Like it can be very easy to take PDE and say like, the reason it is lower this release is only because of how much shit we had going on, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's too much happening. So that's a dangerous use, right? Like you can go in with that hypothesis, right? But like you can't immediately grasp that as the only cause, right? Like you have to keep digging, you have to keep slicing. It's like no. Look at it by area, look at it by severity. Or was it lower mainly because of a giant spike only with one group, and that group had major attrition, which is why it's lower, right? So maybe there was a couple percentage points that were a result of the conflicting priorities for the release, but primarily this big drop could be attributed to an entirely other feature.
Yeah, I think if you walk into it with a specific story in mind, then you may or may not find the data that you need to confirm that story, but without even considering like other alternatives that are maybe more likely or fit the data better, then you're potentially like going to be drawing conclusions that maybe make sense, but they don't make the most sense, right? So I think one of the things that we really have to do is we have to consider all of the possibilities, right? Like we can't just like try and focus on a specific narrative. We really have to like think like, all right, that could be why it happened, but what if it was something else? What might make even more sense than that particular story does?
Yeah, the mindset of searching for truth rather than for, changing the world or whatever, right? Like being open to that you did something or something happened and it was a failure, and you have to just accept that even though you wanted the data to be up, it's not. And not try to search for something that's gonna, save you and say, we did done goofed, but you see, there's one thingy that, is not that bad. And having we're here to like QA for me is super scientific. Like we have to use science to help out. So we have to be searching more for the truth and presenting the data how it is, and trying to find out what is the truth and how we can use it to fix our processes or product, instead of trying to by force changing the product or the company for the better.
Yeah.
Another way that just came to mind is being focused on like where the big buckets of problems are instead of taking a look holistically at the data and identifying like what's something that you could turn around really quickly, right? Like if you focus in, it's like, let's say you have 20 bugs all clustered in one particular area, but in order to fix that, it's going to take an engine overhaul. It's going to take a rewrite of one of our development tools to put in checks, to stop designers from implementing content that way. Or there's 10 bugs over here in this different cluster, and that's a small process change that the team can implement immediately, right? So I would prioritize those 10 bugs just because we can knock that out right away, right? So try not to key in on what the biggest numbers are kind of yelling at and screaming at for attention, and instead make sure you're looking at things holistically. And the last thing I promise is, and we've talked about this a little bit too already, is using it in a retaliatory way, right? Of like trying to find blame. Like we had an escape here, and you did this testing, and you should have caught this bug, right? Like this is your fault. Like, no, that's scary. That's terrible.
Yeah.
Or using it as a designer too.
I would say the only time I would do something like that is if the escaped defect somehow proved gross negligence in the sense of like,
sure,
this should have been caught by a test pass, and we go back and look at the test pass, and the test pass said that this test case had been run. And if we rerun that test case on the same build, we can confirm that, okay, if this test case had in fact been run on this build, they would have caught this bug. Like it was super obvious. So in that particular context, it can be useful for surfacing cases where people are like negligent, but like generally speaking, I'm not going to go into that deep of a dive on something unless I'm either very concerned about why it was missed or very concerned about the particular person who is involved.
And even then, you have to ask questions, right? Again, are they new to testing this content? Was the documentation well enough, right? Like, were the test passes structured in a clear enough way, right? So,
yeah. There's
always
all kinds
asking
of
questions.
Yes, there's all kinds of reasons why someone might mark a test case as passed when it actually should be failed, that don't have anything to do with negligence, right? It could just be a lack of training and all kinds of other things. So
We wanted to be so evil, but then in the end we just turned out that we are good people. Like we started evil and then we went consistent.
I tried
redemption arc.
There's a question I want to ask, and I think the bad version of the question is like, what is a good DDE rate that we should set for our games? I think the better version of this question though is like, how do you set a good goal for DDE for your team before you get to the release, right? Like, so we're not even there yet, like, but we know that we're going to be collecting data on escape defects. So how do we know what to target, right? How do we know what to aim for?
That's a good question.
So as a starting point, this may be a little bit of a cop out, right? But you want to look at your historical data, right? Like, take a look at previous releases and determine, collectively, like this isn't something QA does on its own, but like, okay, for this release, we want to aim for this quality level, right? Like, similar to, we want the game to feel like this previous release in terms of like overall quality and number of defects that the public is reporting. So like setting your DDE to what that one was, like, and aiming for that target, that can be a good starting point. But DDEs, it's scary to just put a flat number and apply it to your whole project and every team and say, do this or else, right? Like, as we've been talking about, individual features should have very different DDE levels, right? Like, depending on how much the public will play it, how impactful the escapes are, is how big your team is, right? How complex is the feature? Everything, all of that should determine what the individual features or team's DDE is. But again, looking at that historical data point and choosing that as like a goal to aim for, I think is a decent starting point at least. And because that way you can start doing reporting during development of any deviations, right? Like, hey, we collectively agreed when we started, we were aiming for a DDE of about 80% for this feature. Right now, the way we're trending, the amount of bugs we're reporting, and what we're forecasting to escape after the fact, we would be coming in at like a 71%. So let's start digging into why. Let's start asking questions. Let's make some pivots.
No, Trevor, 200%, only perfection.
Oh my gosh. Our DDE is so good. It's fixing bugs that don't exist yet.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we're fixing the old ones, the ones we didn't get to last release, right?
Yeah, we're fixing.
Well, you do that anyway.
We're fixing the bugs for features that never existed.
Yeah. All right, so Trevor.
Wait, that actually would put it higher than 100%. Sorry, no.
You said something really interesting there that I want to dig into, which is the word forecast. Now, how are you going to forecast a particular DDE given that we haven't gotten to the actual release yet? How is that even possible?
So I'm going to say the same two words again: historical data, right? Like, if you're releasing a relatively similar product at a relatively similar cadence over a good enough period of time, you start to be able to look at trends, right? And determine, it's like, wow, we consistently are, we have 10 bugs escape for this feature, right? We consistently, as a release, would ship, X amount of bugs. And you can start kind of looking at that and carrying that forward to proactively predict, right? And if your data gets more robust, more complex, you can actually do that based on your bug velocity rates while a feature is in development, right? Like, you can say when we had 200 bugs on this feature, we had 20 escapes. When we had 400 bugs on this feature, we had 40 escapes, right? Like, the more bugs we find ahead of time going in, consistently resulted in us shipping more bugs after the fact too. So, again, if your data is healthy and robust and goes back far enough, you can actually take some pretty informed guesses and stabs at forecasting what it's likely going to be in. And if that data ends up being, relatively correct or within a few percentage points, you can start to anticipate what your live support window is going to look like too. How much time do you need to set aside to respond to live issues that are coming in after you release the game, as opposed to immediately, closing the release and pivoting to the next one.
Yeah. There's a little asterisk there, because usually what can happen in those situations, people will tend to go into God mode, and then I have all the historical data, so now I can see into the future and make accurate predictions. People have to be very careful, and whenever you forecast something, you have to have the assumption that the world is not deterministic. You cannot just, based on all the previous actions and things, determine the future, because there's so many variables into the play. So again, as Trevor does such a wonderful job explaining everything. It's very hard to add anything more. But as long as you ask those informed questions, it will just help you drive for better quality, instead of just saying, hey, I can forecast anything, I can predict the future, so now we're safe.
I'm just trying to imagine a conversation with a producer where they're like, look, we always only have like 200 to 250 bugs on a feature of this size, and we've already found 300, so like there couldn't possibly be any more. You need to move on to the next thing. What are you doing?
Well, here is you introducing 3 new maps into this feature, this release. Here's you introducing this brand new game mode and UI into this feature for this release, right? So we're going to anticipate more bugs, therefore more escapes.
Yeah.
But no, totally right. Like, you're never going to be 100% accurate. I think, like, not on Destiny, right? But on previous games I've worked on, the best I've ever been in terms of prediction was like within 2%. And that was like, oh my God, we freaking nailed it. But most of the time you're looking at like, 10, 15% variance. And like, that's with a pretty decent model too. And that, it's good to give you a ballpark, right? Like, but you shouldn't make concrete decisions. This is exactly how we're going to go. But if I know I can anticipate, let's say, like 200 bugs for release, I know my team takes roughly, 3 minutes to regress a bug, and we can fix 160 bugs in a day, right? Like, I can do that math. I can math it out about, like, how long of a life support window I should roughly plan for.
Yeah.
But even if you're in your example, Ariel, like, I think it's a good example because I see it happening. I don't have concrete situation in my mind, but it might be used as a valid argument of if we have a specific number of bugs for that feature, and let's say it's nothing new there. Like, it can be used as a valid argument. Like, let's not spend more time on testing that because it won't give us more value specifically. Like, it's a dangerous sentence to say, and it sometimes when I think about it, I'm a little bit sweating when I think about it. But it can be a useful argument to use it in that context where you can basically say, I think that's enough. Like, we won't, like, we might find 50 more bugs, but statistically, probably not. So let's end here and focus on something else.
Yeah, when push comes to shove, we're here to manage risk.
I mean,
right?
We don't have infinite money. Like, of course, if we could and we could spend as much money as possible, then sure, for all the testers and all the time, right? But unfortunately, it's not like that. We have limited resources, and we have to be picky about where we, which battles to choose.
And that's exactly the answer you give when the inevitable question you get when you talk about bug escape forecasting is, well, why don't you just catch those ahead of time, right?
Yeah. At one of the companies I used to work at, we used to have green light meetings where we would talk about like whether or not we were giving a thumbs up the green light to go ahead with the release. And every single time I refused to give a green light, I would always give a yellow light. And I also wouldn't give a red light either, right? Unless I actually had cause to. But I always knew that on the other side of that green light was a bunch of escaped defects. And if I said, yep, I think we're ready to go, and then there was like a single escaped defect, they would come back to me and say, well, why didn't we catch this? So I stopped giving them permission to release. I would just say, like, look, all I can tell you is we have fixed all of the showstoppers that we've found so far. If you want to release,
it's a limelight.
yeah. If you still want to release like now, like that is on you. But I don't think we're ready because I haven't finished my tests.
Is it green or tennis ball green?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, though. One interesting stat that's really useful to pair with DDE, especially in this world where we're talking about like a go no go meeting or like prepping for a release. Where it's like, okay, we're anticipating a DDE of 85% or whatever it is, right? A good thing to pair with that is also putting in front of everybody what your punt rate is.
Yeah.
Like saying like, hey, by the way, we're going to go live with 200 bugs that we already know about.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually.
Just for everybody in the room's sake, remember that.
Yeah, because like if you go live expecting a like 80% DDE, for example, and 5% of the bugs you found you're going to punt, that is potentially a very different experience than going live and having an 80% DDE, but 20% of the bugs that you found were punted, right? Because now what the players experience is a 40% rate of unfixed bugs, right? They are experiencing a much bigger gap between what they feel like should be the number of fixed bugs and what the rate of fixed bugs actually is. So you can't punt your way out of having bad quality essentially. But anyway, so I think that's a really interesting thing to think about is not only do you want to worry about the escaped defects, but you want to also consider the combination of escaped defects plus punted defects, because there's an overall feeling of bugginess that comes with a game that has too many punted or escaped defects. Imagine if a really buggy. I'm just going to reach for Cyberpunk as an example here. But imagine if Cyberpunk had released with every single one of the bugs in that game being known, right? It would still feel buggy to players, right? They wouldn't be able to get away from that just by virtue of having found and punted all of the bugs. So, yeah, I think it's great that you brought that up, because I hadn't even thought about it until you just said it now.
Yeah. Sarah brought up a good question, because we were talking about discussions and discoveries, investigations. But how do we report on DDE? You just don't show up on a meeting and be like 90%.
90%, we're good. End of discussion. Yeah, I think.
Go on.
I think the one of the things I want to look at is priority of escaped defects. That's a big one for me, because there's a huge difference between having an 80% low priority DDE and an 80% high priority or showstopper DDE. That is much scarier, right? My target rate for DDE is going to be much higher on the high priority and showstopper issues, because I want to make sure that we're prioritizing finding those, because they're the scariest and they cause the biggest risk. So one of the things that I would want to look at is priority. And then the other thing is what Trevor has been talking about in terms of looking at it across different teams. So, I think potentially what a report could look like is you could talk about the DDE for a release overall across different priorities, and then break it down in feature. And okay, here's how we scored in all of these different areas. Those I think would be the big things that I would want to include. And now I want to include punt rate and add that in. And there's all kinds of other interesting things that you could do too. You could try and assess player sentiment of bugginess on specific features. Maybe by looking at the number of times a specific thing gets brought up in a feedback submission. So what I've done in previous companies is we've had all of these feedback submissions that we get from players go into this pool that we then collect data on, how many times did someone say this, or how many times did someone say this word, right? And you could look at did people feel like a specific area was more buggy than another area? Were people saying that quests were buggy, or were they saying that combat was buggy, or the performance was buggy? What was sort of the thing that people were complaining about the most? But even going back to what we said earlier, all of this just drives more questions. You can't look at any of these things as the end all be all of conclusions to draw.
I would report on everything Ariel just said, and then I would also throw in the what are we doing about it piece.
Yeah.
Right. How many of these have we decided we're going to take no action on in the future? How many of these are we going to turn into changes to our test passes? How many of these are brand new test cases or test passes that we're going to introduce? How many were legitimate bug escapes? We should have caught this. We ran the testing. We didn't. Another fun one is how many of these escapes were the result of testing that we intentionally like didn't have time for? Like this was planned and we had to cut back either, due to a myriad of reasons. I would go more in depth on that if I was presenting this data to a small team or an area or a feature, right? Like you really want to dig into what are we going to do as a group to reduce this rate of escapes going forward. Here's what we're doing on the test side. Here's the process changes we need, production's help with. Here's the different workflows that we'd like to have design approach with, right? And it's very collaborative. As opposed to a more executive summary, you'd be focusing more on the whole and percentages and trends and like calling out if there were key areas that like really deviated from what you would have expected going forward.
So I have now it came to me a good question. Imagine that you don't use DD on your project. What would be your tips to start tracking that and reporting on that? Because in my mind, it's going to be also a scary statistic. Because what if you report on that and then production or whoever says like, hey QA, why the number is so low? Like, are you doing your work? Like, people might be scary to use that. So what would be our tips to reduce the process so we move the scare away and we can use that to improve the project?
I think early on, you're going to be met with a lot of confusion. Like, what is this? What is this number you're putting in front of me? What does this mean? Right. And like you called out, it is a very scary thing to put a direct number on how good QA is. Right. So you want to do as much as you can to divest it away from that initially. Put the emphasis on, hey, we don't know what a good number is for us. We just don't. We're not going to know for a while until we have a number of releases and we have a number of data sets that we can draw upon to determine, like, what was a good release? What was a bad one? What felt good? What felt bad? Bring feelings into it. Oh, no. But, like, you want to correlate the feelings with, like, data points to kind of anchor them into something real. So initially, like, setting expectations like, hey, this isn't a scary number. We're not doing anything crazy with this, but we want to start capturing this so we can over time. In the meantime, what we are going to do with this is find ways to be better at testing. And that's where you put the emphasis more on the what are you doing about the escapes piece of this.
And and I would say that, like, collecting data like this and then, helping the team draw interesting conclusions with it is not going to make you look bad. It's going to make you look very good because they're going to, especially if they've never had a test team do anything like this before, they're going to be like, oh my God, like we haven't even been thinking about looking at like stuff like stats like this before. And this is going to like totally revolutionize how we approach like what areas we're testing and how we're like, asking questions about like what we can do to reduce bug count and stuff like that. Like there's so many positives that come from like collecting data and being able to talk about data that I think if people like it would be very shocking to me if they got lost in the weeds of like, but the stat is bad, right? Like it's like, yeah, but you have it now, right? Like isn't that a good thing? Like isn't it good that we're now able to have this conversation because we collected this data? And I think that like it would just be very strange to me if someone looked at QA taking the time to put together a very well thought out report on like how our defects escaped and what we're going to do to prevent them from escaping in the future, and then said to themselves, well, clearly QA is not doing their job. Like they just did their job. They told you where all the defects came from, right? I honestly think that like being able to talk about data like this and talk about it in a way that is productive and helps people find solutions and improve the overall process of the team, that's only going to make you look good, right? Yeah. Like it's not going to make you look bad.
I've never worked on a team that was upset that QA was trying to be better.
Yeah, exactly. Or that they were, trying to find like concrete, like measurable ways to say that they had improved or hadn't improved, right? Like, I can almost imagine there are folks out there I can imagine being like, well, why are you spending all this time collecting data instead of just finding bugs or something like that? But then to that you can say, well, what bugs, right? Don't you want us to find the right bugs? Don't you want us to find like the most important and scariest bugs? Like, because we're not going to find all of them, right? I can tell you that right now. Like, we're not going to find every single bug that we release in this game. So isn't it better that we spend a little bit of time collecting the data and looking at data so that we can make sure that our testing time is spent as efficiently as possible, and so that we don't have these scary bugs that make us look bad or that cost the company money or otherwise damage our reputation, right? Like the impact from taking that little bit of time and looking at data and analyzing data, it can be huge, and it's worth it. It's worth the effort. And then the fun part about doing all of this data collection is you're going to have the data to support your claim about what this helping you identify more important bugs and focusing on the right areas, because it's just going to do that, right? As long as you're not using your data for villainy, like we were talking about earlier.
And it may feel intimidating, like all the things that we've talked about, but honestly, if your database is set up in a healthy way, in particular, like Jira has a number of tools to just passively collect a lot of this already. Like, you can set up pretty simple queries to just have the data. It's some basic math that you can do. Like, once you get in the groove and you feel comfortable doing this, it's not a massive time investment at all.
Yeah.
Like, most of my time, if I'm reporting on this, is going into the PowerPoint deck and putting memes in there to keep people's attention. It's not the math and drawing conclusions.
Yeah, that was. Thank you for the answer. That was the takeaway I wanted to give to people. That it's scary to shine light at your department, but I think because we are the quality department, we should be the example to show everybody else. Look, we can be honest about our work and about everything that we do. So then we saw example to other teams to do the same, and it's done for a reason, to make our product and our work better. Yeah.
I mean, it can be scary to shine a light on your work, but at the same time, having a flashlight is pretty handy if you're in the dark. All right.
It's super healthy.
Well, thank you both for participating in this conversation with me. This has been super enlightening. I have honestly learned a lot in the past couple of weeks about escape defects and how we can look at them just through this and through the conversations that we had in our Discord about it. So I really want to thank both Trevor and Marcin for being a part of this episode today. So just to kind of give a quick summary of what we talked about data today and how it can tell a story, and but specifically we talked about the data point of default detection efficiency, which refers to the rate or percentage at which bugs are the bugs that we find versus the bugs that actually manage to escape into the live environment. So there's all sorts of interesting things that you can look at with escape defects, like the escape defects for different features, the escape defects at different priority levels. You can ask all sorts of interesting questions and make potentially interesting changes to how you're approaching your testing processes based on those escape defects. Like maybe this area has too many escape defects, you need to spend more time over there, or maybe this area actually doesn't have any escape defects at all, and we need to look at whether or not our people over there are overworked. Or maybe they're spending too much time on the wrong things, and we could be having them spend their time elsewhere. We also talked a lot about how to use DDE for good instead of for evil, and I feel like we got some good answers there. And so, yeah, again, I want to thank Trevor and Marcin, for both of you, for participating today. This was awesome. So now I want to move on to the bug of the cast. And I forget which one of you had today's bug of the cast. I think it was Trevor.
Yeah, I got one. So previous game I worked on, very popular MMO out there, had the ability to queue up for random PvP matches, right? And it would group players based on level ranges. So let's say, for example, a level 51 player would potentially be grouped with anyone from level 51 all the way up to 60. And after release, we started getting random reports that players were getting de-leveled after coming out of PvP matches. And we're like, okay, what's going on there? So after a bit of investigation and digging, where we landed was a very, very, very specific edge case. So one of the classes in this game had the ability to mind control another player. And when that player was mind controlled, they were effectively considered to be a pet of the player mind controlling them. Now, normally this is fine. Mind control as a spell will end. Everything goes back to normal. But if a player, like a lower level player, mind controlled a higher level player, it would set their level down to, let's say, 51 in this example instead of 60. Then, if the PvP match ended while the mind control was still in progress, and the bonus XP you got from finishing a PvP match was awarded to the level 51 player, was enough to push them to level 52, that would level them to 52, and then the game would say, okay, set your player pet level to 52 as well, which would override the player level of the other player and set them to 52.
Damn.
This is like edge case of edge cases right here. Like, I can't even imagine like how you would like create a test case to potentially catch this if you had never heard of something like this happening before.
Yeah, like it led to a fundamental way of like recoding how the game treats another player when they're mind controlled. Like, that's the only way you could prevent something like this.
Don't treat players like pets.
Yeah.
Except in certain cases. No. All right, awesome. Well, that's it for us today, and we'd like to also thank the audience for listening. We would not be doing this podcast without you. If you have any suggestions for future topics or bugs of the day, we would love to hear them. And if you are a QA professional and would like to be on the podcast, we would love to have you. In either case, please contact us at undergroundgameqaconf@gmail.com or reach out to us on Twitter at undergroundqa because we would love to hear from you and collaborate. So before we go, do either of you have anything you would like to plug?
Nope, I'm good. I just do my job and play games with friends. That's pretty much it.
I want to plug to be data-driven, even though everybody usually cringes whenever you say be data-driven, but be scientific in QA, be data-driven, and it's going to make our lives much fun and easier.
Sweet. And I just want to plug washing your hands. Please make sure you do that. It's always good to wash your hands, no matter no matter what's going on in the world. So thank you everyone for listening. Keep playing, keep testing, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you. This was a blast.